the reason we're all here tonight. I'd like to introduce Tara Howatt. Tara Howatt is an assistant professor in the School of Science at YukonU, where she teaches physical geography and environmental science courses. Tara moved to the Yukon after cycling the Dempster Highway and has lived in the Yukon for 5 years. When she's not teaching, Tara enjoys spending time on water in her canoe in the summer and on her cross-country skis in the winter. So a regular Yukon gal. But first up this evening is Bill. Bill Halliday is a conservation scientist and Arctic acoustic program lead with Wildlife Conservation Society Canada, based in Whitehorse, and is an adjunct professor in the School of Earth and Ocean Sciences at the University of Victoria. Bill has lived in the Yukon for 3 years. He's been doing research in the Yukon up in the Arctic Ocean for 10 years. He was first introduced to research during his first summer field technician job, where he camped on Herschel Island for 10 weeks in 2008, catching lemmings all summer. I hear he may have done some of that work with Don and Maria. Don, who is one of our directors at the Yukon Science Institute. His research is funded by Fisheries and Oceans Canada, the Weston Family Foundation, and the Inuvialuit Fisheries Joint Management Committee. So really excited to have them both here, and I'll let Bill take it away. But come on up on the stage. So as we have done in previous evenings, we'll have folks hold their questions till both Tara and Bill have presented their research, and then I'll invite you to ask them anything you'd like. Without the microphones tonight, what we'll do is I'll ask you to kind of bellow your questions. I'll repeat them on the microphone up here for folks who can't hear, and then they'll come up and take turns answering your questions. So I apologize for not having roaming microphones tonight. And for folks online, you will definitely get an opportunity to ask questions. I do ask that you type your questions in the chat, and at the end of both presentations, we will certainly get to those questions. So feel free. All right, let me take it away.
Great. Thank you, Kate. And thanks everyone for coming out on a Sunday night. I know anyone with young families like mine, they're busy getting ready for school right now. So thanks to my wife for letting me come tonight. So I'm going to be talking to you about the research that we do in the Western Canadian Arctic on the impacts of ship traffic on marine mammals. We also are interested in the impacts on fish as well. But tonight I'll talk about marine mammals. And I should say that Tara and I are collaborating on this project, and that's why we're tag teaming the project here tonight. So I'm going to give a lot of background about ship traffic and why we should care about it, and some of the other research that we've done. And then Tara's going to come talk about the new tech that we use, this lovely glider at the front that she's going to introduce in a bit. Okay, so make sure this video is actually playing. So the Arctic is often defined by very extreme changes in light levels and also extreme changes in sea ice concentration. So I'm going to leave this video playing in the background while I talk a little bit about this introduction. But just to give you an idea of what we're looking at, this video, you can see it contract and expand. The contractions are the melting of sea ice during the summer, and the expansion is the forming of sea ice in the winter. And the really white mass in the middle is old ice, ice that has lasted for more than a year, sometimes even more than 5 years on this scale. So what we would call multi-year ice. And this is eventually, we'll start showing you the years, and we'll show you through time what's happened since the 1990s all the way until the 2010s. I think it goes until about 2016, this particular video. So the Arctic is very much, a lot of the animals in the Arctic, I should say, very much have evolved to deal with this seasonal cycle, right? Dark winters with a lot of sea ice, and then very bright summers with less sea ice. And historically, most areas of the Arctic still had some sea ice around for the summertime, but that's been changing. And so you can see now that we started in 1991, and it's going to cycle through every month of the year all the way until 2016 right now. And so back in 1991, that summer sea ice was still hanging around the mainland coast of North America and Russia. And as we go, we're going to see the summer sea ice come further and further offshore into the middle of the Arctic Ocean, and we're going to see less and less of that multi-year sea ice, of that old ice. Eventually, you're going to see that old sea ice really only follows a very thin track in the very center of the Arctic Ocean and close to the Canadian Arctic archipelago. So the animals that we're talking about tonight, the marine mammals, they've evolved in this very ice-covered environment, and that's changing quite rapidly on them right now. In just a couple of decades, we went from seeing ice all summer long along the mainland coast to no ice along the mainland coast. This has a lot of implications for these animals just in terms of their day-to-day lives, but it also has big implications for other activities. And into tonight's topic, ship traffic. Ship traffic was historically limited by sea ice, but we're seeing, video tried to replay on me, but we're seeing now that there's more and more ship traffic. And so when we talk about ship traffic in the Arctic, it varies quite a bit geographically. Again, here's another polar view of the Arctic. We've got Canada and the United States on the bottom. We've got Russia on the top. And so we've got a few main routes through the Arctic that ships can take. We've got the Northern Sea route along Russia's coast in green. We have the Northwest Passage along United States and Canada's coast in pink. And those are the two big shipping routes that people tend to talk about when they talk about shipping in the Arctic. And what we've been seeing is that both of those routes have been seeing more and more traffic through the years. There's also this purple route, the transpolar route. That doesn't really exist yet. That's a future route. That's the future of Arctic shipping if these trends in sea ice keep happening. And so over the last 40 years, along with those changing ice conditions, we've also seen pretty large changes in ship traffic. This figure is by Jackie Dawson at the University of Ottawa. One of the main outputs from her lab is these sorts of studies on ship traffic. This shows how many kilometers per year all the ships in the Canadian Arctic travel, kind of an estimate of the volume of ship traffic. And so we see from the 1990s, roughly around 400,000 kilometers per year. And it stayed fairly constant through time up until about 2006. And then there was a break point. Things started increasing. And by 2015, there was a doubling of traffic between 1990 and 2015. There's been more analyses done since then. The Protection of the Arctic Marine Environment Working Group with the Arctic Council has continued on a lot of this work across the whole Arctic, and they saw another doubling in ship traffic between 2013 and 2024. And so we're seeing doubling every 10 years effectively of this ship traffic. And with the projections of what's going to happen in the Arctic in the future, the current projections are that the entire Arctic is going to be, or at least the entire Canadian Arctic, will be ice-free during the summer by 2050. And so if that happens, it's completely open range for the ships. They can go wherever they want. So we'll see if that actually happens, but it's being monitored. When we think about ship traffic and what it can do to marine mammals, there's a few different impacts that we can think about. The one that I study the most, which is why it's at the top of the list, is underwater noise, and I'll get into what that is in a little bit. There's also ship strikes, where the ship impacts a whale, for example. We've seen that a lot with North Atlantic right whales in around Nova Scotia these days. Ships can also cause pollution, and we're not just talking about oil spills when a ship goes aground. There's also pollution that happens from a ship constantly, effectively, every time they release their gray water. For example, that's a form of pollution. Ships are also a vector of invasive species. So they can have species from the south stuck to their hulls, and then those fall off in the north, and they can get carried up that way. Ships also take on something called ballast water, so large amounts of water to maintain their balance. And then when they take on more load, they'll eject all of that water. They'll empty it out. And so any species that get sucked up somewhere else can then get deposited where they get rid of their ballast water. So there's a bunch of different impacts. They all have varying degrees of impact on the environment. Into underwater noise, as I promised, I'd talk about that because that's mostly what I study these days. And so most human activities in and around the water cause some form of underwater noise. For ships in particular, the thing we're talking about the most is their propellers and their cavitation. When propellers spin, they create little tiny bubbles, and those bubbles burst. And when you think about a bubble bursting, you probably don't think it's very loud. But when there are millions of bubbles every rotation of a propeller, and they're all bursting at the same time, it leads to this very loud, low frequency underwater noise that can propagate over tens of kilometers. Ships' engines are also quite loud. If they're doing other operations like this one in the bottom left, that one's dragging seismic air guns to do air gun surveys, where they're looking for, say, for example, oil and gas deposits along the seafloor. They can create all sorts of other noise on top of those regular ship noises. Depth sounders and naval sonar or other sources of noise that ships can create. So why should we care about underwater noise? So the ocean is a very dark place. Marine mammals dive, some of them, 1,000 meters deep. Beluga whales have been shown to go 1,400 meters deep. There is no light that makes it down that far, which means that they're relying 100% on their other senses. Sound in particular. Beluga whales, for example, are echolocators, and so they're relying on the high frequency sounds that they make to sense the environment. They also, whales and other marine mammals, seals, also use sound to communicate with one another, and so it's a pretty important way for animals to stay in touch, especially over long distances. These animals can stay in contact much further than they can see. For example, beluga whales can likely be whistling back and forth to each other from, say, 2 to 5 kilometers away underwater. Bowhead whales, their songs can be detected 100 kilometers away. And so we're talking about very long distance communication in some of these cases anyways. And it's not just marine mammals. I'll make a plug for this for some of our other work. It's also fish and invertebrates. They also make sounds, and fish in particular are likely using those sounds for communication as well. So because sound is important for these animals, any extra noise in the environment can cause issues. So underwater noise can have a bunch of different issues. The very most obvious one is called acoustic masking. This room is very quiet because you're all being very good and listening to me. But can you imagine if you were all talking simultaneously right now, and then you tried to listen to someone across the room from you? Would you be able to hear them if you also had all of your neighbors around you talking? Probably not. Now imagine the fans turn on, the ventilation comes on, it gets really loud in here from all the other noise happening. Or maybe let's move our conversation outside beside the highway and a bunch of transport trucks go by. It can be very difficult to hear one another. It's the same thing underwater. And because sound propagates really efficiently underwater, that ship could be 10 kilometers away and it could be the same as you standing beside the highway. Animals are also reacting to the noise. So not only is it impacting what they can hear, but they may also change what they're doing in response to the noise. And so we've seen that animals that are foraging or hunting may stop foraging when they have too much noise. They may leave an area entirely. They may stop communicating with one another. There's physiological effects. Animals can get more stressed out when they are exposed to too much noise. They can also have temporary or permanent hearing damage that can happen, what we call threshold shifts. The noise has to be fairly loud for that. One ship passing may not cause hearing damage, but 100 ships passing could. And then finally, death. And this may sound extreme, but it has happened. So death from a noise usually will only directly happen if the noise is really loud. From something called barotrauma. Effectively, there's too much pressure and that can cause internal organs to rupture. That's not going to happen from ships. However, there have been certain animals that react to loud signals like a naval sonar, and they'll change their diving behavior. They'll dive really deep, or they'll come to the surface very suddenly, and they'll get decompression sickness, just like a diver, which can then lead to death down the road, effectively. And they've shown that a lot with beaked whales, for example, around naval activities. The other thing to keep in mind when we're talking about the Arctic in particular is where we are. And so we often come into research with our own perspectives, but when we're working up north, we also have to think about the people who have lived in the land for thousands of years. And so Inuit have had and continue to have very strong ties to the marine environment, relying on marine species for both subsistence and culture. So effectively, any Inuit community where you go to, if you start talking about ship traffic or underwater noise, they're immediately going to have people within that community, especially hunters, are immediately going to have concerns about, well, when that ship comes by, it's going to make it so that the animals that I'm hunting or the fish that we're trying to catch with our net leave the area and we can no longer get them. And so there are these indirect effects of underwater noise on the people that are living traditional ways in the Arctic. All right, so that brings me into our research and kind of the main goals that we're doing, and then what I'll be talking about here tonight. So my research program at Wildlife Conservation Society Canada has 4 main goals. The first is monitoring the impacts of climate change on marine mammals and fish. The second, third, and fourth goals are all related to underwater noise. So first, monitoring how much noise there is in the marine environment and how that's changing through time and how marine mammals are getting exposed to that noise. Monitoring how that ship noise exposure actually impacts the marine mammals. And then finally, working towards ways of managing and mitigating those risks of underwater noise to the animals. And as you probably guessed, I'll be talking about those ship noise specific ones tonight. So we work in the Western Canadian Arctic. This is the Inuvialuit Settlement Region. So I'm missing the border here, but out here is the Yukon, and then the rest is Northwest Territories. So we do technically still research in the Yukon. We have 1 recorder in the Yukon. All of the red dots up on this map are locations where we have year-round acoustic recorders in the ocean. And so right now we're maintaining 14 sites across the region. Many are close to communities where we work with local community members, such as here, where Adam Kudlak has taken us out in his boat to recover a recorder. And then in the sites that are further from communities, such as all of these off of Cape Bathurst, for example, we're working with Fisheries and Oceans Canada off of their Coast Guard icebreakers because it's much more difficult to get to those sites out of a small boat. So these recorders are staying out, like I said, for a year at a time, and we're in the 10th year of the study now. We haven't had all of these sites out for 10 years, but this is where we're at right now. Once we get the data back, first of all, we've got a big data problem. We're collecting, at the moment, 14 sites. Each of them gets 500 gigabytes of data. So I'm looking at, the math is fairly simple there, 7 terabytes of data every year coming back right now. That's a lot of data. That is hundreds of thousands of audio files to go through. And so originally, when we were just collecting data from, say, 2 sites, I would go through them manually. We would look for these signatures of ship noise. Now we're working with more automated methods where we've got detectors that will go through and pull out those signals for us because I don't want to look through 200,000 files every year for ship noise. But what this figure is on the left here, it's what we call a spectrogram. So it's got the frequency of the sound from low frequencies all the way up to high frequencies on the y-axis, and then time on the x-axis. And then the colors represent the loudness of the signal, with blue being quiet and red being quite loud. And so what this particular spectrogram is a ship noise signature. There's lots of long, flat, what we call tonal signals. Those are caused by the engine, various parts of the engine turning, as well as the propeller. And then this pattern in the middle, that's what we call the closest point of approach. So right in the middle of this is where the ship is as close to the hydrophone as it's going to get when it's traveling by. So we can use this type of signature to effectively, that's what we've trained all of our detectors on, to go through and find these signatures and find where the ship noise is in our data. From that, we can get time series like this one. This is from Ulahaktuk back in 2017, I believe. And so we were able to classify all the small boats from the community as these white bars, and then all the black bars are from the larger ships like cruise ships and the tug that comes to resupply the community every year and the Coast Guard ship that came by. There are a couple others as well. And so with every data set we get back, we're aiming to get some sort of time series of like this so that we can look at how much noise is there in the environment, human-made noise, that is. From there, we can take measurements of all those individual ship passes and look at things like how loud is it when there's 1 ship, 2 ships, or even 3 ships near the community. And so we can generally see more ships equals more noise. And also, how loud is it as ships get closer to the recorder? And we generally see that it's louder when the ships are closer, just like it would be louder if I was talking in your ear versus if I was right up here. From there, we're also trying to measure what we call the source level of those ships. So when our hydrophone measures it, the ship could be a kilometer away. And so we can back calculate how loud would it be if the hydrophone was right beside the ship. And that gives us a comparable measurement across all of the ships, a comparable distance. And we can compare it back to measurements taken in other areas. For example, there's thousands and thousands of measurements of ships happening near the port of Vancouver, for example. And so we're able to see, well, are the ships that we're measuring up in the Arctic as loud as the ships near Vancouver? The answer is not really. They're different. Some of them are louder, some of them are quieter. The models that they've developed based on ships down south don't seem to match well with the ships we see up north. And that might be related to just completely different ships. The ships that are traveling in the Arctic are all ice strengthened, so they've got very thick hulls, probably different types of propellers on them as well, which can lead to different sound trends. Once we get all those measurements, we can start to model out how much noise there is. Because if we have a network of 14 recorders across this large area, there's a lot of gaps in where we're actually measuring. And so we can take the ship tracks that we get from satellites and we can then model, well, here's the noise footprint. Here's how far that noise propagates away from the ship. So all the little fireflies going across the screen here are individual ships and the noise that we've modeled away from them. You can see that some are very small little circles and some are much larger. And generally those are going to be small ships versus large ships. Larger ships have larger noise footprints. The kind of shifting background here that you see is just the impact of storms and windiness effectively on natural sound levels. So there's natural variability in the sound in the environment, but then there's all of the human noise on top of that. So this model is just for 2023. We're currently working on validating this with whenever one of those ships came near one of our recorders, we're seeing, did the model actually match up with what we measured? So once we know how loud the ships are, then we can get into that exposure question. How often are marine mammals getting exposed to noise? And so this looks really busy now that I'm seeing it up on the screen. So on the left, 4 panels, those are points from beluga whales that were tagged with satellite telemetry devices. And then on the right are the same for bowhead whales. We looked at the 4 months of the shipping season, so July, August, September, and October for each species. And then those shapes, those colorful shapes in the background are effectively like the average distribution of those tagged whales in each of the months. And so we see in July and August for both species, they're in Canada, they're in the Western Canadian Arctic. And then in September, both species have started migrating into Alaska. And then by October, they're pretty much fully within the Chukchi Sea, which is between Alaska and Russia, with some slight differences for each of the 2 species. We can then take the ship tracks. And so all of these black lines are the ship tracks within a month. And this is specifically in 2017. And we can see how often those ship tracks go through those whale areas. So in July, not too many tracks happening, just a couple. In August, it starts to get a bit busier. But then as soon as the whales have started their migration into Alaska, they start to get a lot more overlap. And in October in particular, when they're right near the Bering Strait, that's where they're getting a lot of exposure. We can then take that noise model that I showed you earlier with the little fireflies going across the screen and apply that to all of those ship tracks so that we can try to get at how much noise exposure happens within each of those areas. And so there's a lot going on here. I modeled it for 3 years. In 2015 is on the left, in 2016 is in the middle, and 2017 is on the right. And generally, what I was describing earlier with the ship tracks alone is what we see. We see less noise exposure happening in July, a little bit more happening in August, but then again in September and October, we're seeing a lot of noise exposure happening in those areas, in particular of October of 2017, when there was a lot of oil and gas activity happening. They were doing a bunch of surveys in the Chukchi Sea that year. Looking at it a different way, we can look at when individual whales come close to individual ships. So ships and whales that are happening at the same point in time. All of these points represent points where a whale was relatively close to a ship. So beluga whales are being shown on the left, bowhead whales are being shown on the right. And we're seeing relatively the same kind of areas of overlap, especially for bowhead whales along that kind of Alaskan coast. A little bit within Canada. Beluga whales actually had a lot more, skipping around here. Beluga whales had a lot more exposure happening in Canada than the bowhead whales did. and a big number over in the Chukchi Sea as well. Once we know about exposure, we want to know more about, all right, the whale gets exposed. Then what happens? Does it do anything? What's the impact of that ship noise to that whale? And so we've done a couple of different studies with beluga whales, for example. So this figure on the left, that's when we looked at individual whales versus individual ships. We found that as belugas got closer and closer to the ship, they started swimming faster, which is perhaps indicative of a flee response where they're trying to get away from the ship. On the right, we used some of our acoustic recorder data to look at how many beluga vocalizations we picked up when a ship was within 5 kilometers of a recorder. So here's before the ship arrived, when the ship was within 5 kilometers, and then after the ship has left. And we saw a fairly dramatic reduction in vocalizations that we were picking up when the ship was close by. That could either be that the whales started to go quiet, we picked up less vocalizations, or they just left the area. So because they were gone, we didn't pick up as many vocalizations either. It could be either of those, and unfortunately with acoustic recorder data, we don't have any visual sightings to go along with it, so we're not sure which. Speaking with some Inuvialuit elders about these results, though, they think it's likely a flee response, so that puts a little bit more weight behind that hypothesis. We did similar studies with bowhead whales. We found nothing with the bowhead whales and their movement data. We didn't find any effect of the proximity to a ship versus their movement behavior, but we also didn't have very many close passages or close encounters between bowheads and ships. So that might be what's leading to that trend. But we did find that their vocalizations decreased as there were more boats nearby. That particular year also had some seismic airgun surveys happening, and we also found that the bowheads were less likely to vocalize when there were airgun noises as well. So, actually, in the interest of time, I'm just going to skip over that. We have some ongoing noise impact and exposure studies happening right now. I've talked exclusively about whales so far, so we're starting to add seals into the mix. We've got some acoustic analyses looking at ring seals, for example, and also some more telemetry studies looking at ring seals in Nunavut specifically. So then into the bigger question of, all right, marine mammals are getting exposed to noise from ships. They seem to be reacting to that ship noise. Can we do anything? And so in terms of ships, there are a few things that we can do. One would be identify where the important areas are for the species. So particularly sensitive areas, like areas where they're calving or areas where they're mating or foraging or something like that, and try to limit the noisy activities within that area. So trying to have less ship traffic in those sensitive areas. We could also just try to reduce the noise level of the ship itself. There are some technological fixes to make ships less noisy, and engineers are currently working on that. It's going to take a while for the whole fleet to change, though. There's also some operational solutions, like traveling slower. Generally, a slower ship is a quieter ship, and so having ships go slow in some of those areas could be useful. So within the Canadian Arctic, there are already some management measures in place. There are some protected areas in both the Northwest Territories and Nunavut that currently have some measures in place. So within the Inuvialuit Settlement Region, there's 2 protected areas, the Anganakuya Nikikum and Tarium Niritate protected areas near Tuktoyaktuk and Paulatuk. And both of those have voluntary measures in place such that vessels are asked not to go in those areas. Then in Nunavut, there's the Ninging National Wildlife Area near Clyde River. And for that one, vessels need a permit to go into it. And they're generally asking only those who have the permit to go into the area. There's also some slowdowns, so places where vessels are asked to limit their speed. So there's voluntary slowdowns in the Inuvialuit Settlement Region, and I'm going to talk about those in a minute. Those are in important areas for beluga and bowhead whales. And then in Eclipse Sound near the Mary River iron ore mine that some of you may have heard of before, there's also a slowdown happening there. There's also a lot of interest in new protected areas across the Arctic. And with new protected areas, there's the option of adding in management to try and reduce those impacts. So one thing that we've been trying to do along those lines is figure out how effective different management measures could be. And so we looked at those ideas of either an avoidance area or a slowdown to see how much of a noise reduction might we see. And so this was focused on an area near Baffin Bay. I just mentioned the Ningin National Wildlife Area near Clyde River. That's this area right here. We took all of the ship tracks in the area and modeled how much noise there would be. That's this very big bright panel up here. We then took all of those ships and made it so that they were all traveling at 10 knots or less and modeled how much noise there would be. And we see a slight reduction. This figure on the left has very bright colors, and they're slightly less bright on the right. You'll have to take my word for it if that doesn't look all that convincing. We then looked at a different management measure. What if we made a corridor? What if we made all of the large ships travel further offshore away from the whale areas? One thing you couldn't see in these top figures very well was that there are actually some whale areas that were outlined in this kind of pinky color, but there were too many bright colors at the top to really see them. So these are the concentration areas for bowhead whales during that month. We moved those large ships into this corridor offshore, and wouldn't you know it, the ships don't go through the whale areas and there's less noise. There's still a few ships going through. We just moved the large ships offshore. And then over on the bottom right is a combination of the two. We move the large ships offshore and we make all ships go slow. So these are just hypothetical. This is just a model. But what we can see is generally that combination of moving ships and making them go slower should be much more effective than just one of those measures on their own. All right. I'm just going to end off here by just showing you this map, which is the current voluntary management measures in the Inuvialuit Settlement Region. And so they put out this map. Coast Guard puts out this map every year, and effectively just to show captains who are planning their routes, there are these important areas in the Western Canadian Arctic, and here's what the local managers are asking you to do. So the yellow areas are areas identified by Inuvialuit as important for bullhead and beluga whales. And then the red areas are the two marine protected areas. And so they're sending out this map and saying, please, if you can, travel slow, travel less than 10 knots when you're going through the yellow area and avoid the red areas if possible. If not possible, then travel slow in those areas as well. We're starting to monitor what the ships are doing in response to this slowdown. Generally, you may have noticed this is a very large area. This is hundreds of kilometers wide, and it's voluntary. And you might expect that a ship that carries about the money that it's making maybe isn't going to want to slow down if it doesn't have to. And unfortunately, that's what we're currently seeing, is that in these whale areas across this large area, they don't seem to be slowing down yet. They do seem to be avoiding the marine protected areas more. So there is a little bit of good happening with this voluntary measure, but it may mean that something a bit more mandatory has to happen in the future. Okay, so with that, and just thinking about time, I'm going to pass it over to Tara, and she'll finish us off talking about the glider. Thank you.
All right. Yeah, so I'll talk a bit about the gliders. And how we're using it to study the ocean as well as underwater noise impacts on marine mammals. I'm going to start off by walking through some of the challenges that we have with making marine observations. So if you're going out into the ocean, you're going into remote locations, right? So even if you're going off the west coast of British Columbia or off of Nova Scotia, you're going into the ocean, you're away from land, from any resources that you need. So you need to take what you need on the boat. It doesn't take very long for you to lose cell service. And yeah, and so that's very much true in the Arctic as well. Right, we're working in remote locations. And yeah, it can also be very expensive to go to those locations and to spend money for ship time. For our work up in the Arctic, with the glider, we're working out of Ulahuktuk, and we are hiring local boat operators and using their boats. So they tend to have smaller boats, so we have limited access to big boats. We have a photo here of Leanne, one of my research assistants, and myself. And as you can see, we're taking up pretty much the whole boat with a laptop. And so, yeah, when you go out in small boats, you're close to the water, so that makes it really easy to put the glider into the water if you're, or if you're sending other sorts of instruments over the side. But then you're also going to be out, you'll want to be safe to go out when the weather conditions and the sea conditions are good. Right, so that can limit when we can go out. It can also limit where we go out as well. So that being said, when you're doing marine sampling from a boat, you're generally limited to going out when the weather and the ocean conditions are good. So we tend not to sample during adverse weather conditions when it's really stormy. This is a photo from some field work I did during my PhD. So this is on a somewhat larger boat. There's a little cabin on it. But this was our good weather window to go out and pick up a similar glider. So as you can see, right, waves are coming up onto the boat. Also, particularly up in the Arctic, the water is cold. This is a photo from our field camp last year. So as you can see, going out in July, there's still ice. At least this last year, there was still ice out. So it was cold. And that can impact our batteries. That's the other photo way on the left I have there. So those are all of the batteries that we have inside of the glider. So cold temperatures tend to drain batteries faster than warmer waters. So yeah, other limitations or challenges is time and space limitations. So if you're going on a boat and sending instruments over the side, this is a photo of some CTDs. So it's just sending a sensor over the side of the boat, and you're lowering it by a line. So this is one of my other research assistants, Ayla. At this point, she's very cheerful. Yeah, so when you're lowering it by hand, it was a lot of muscle and ab work. So you're lowering it down, you'll pull it back up, then you'll go maybe a couple hundred meters. If you're on a larger boat, maybe several kilometers, several hundred kilometers to your next station, right? So you're taking one profile, you're going a very far distance, collecting another profile. With some of the moorings as well, like what Bill uses, you put that out, it's in one location, it's sampling recording, so you get a really long time series, but then you're getting information just at one location. Right, so we can think about ways of, how can we maybe reduce some of these challenges? We can maybe look towards science fiction. So Henry Stommel was a physical oceanographer, so he was a researcher. But he wrote this piece of science fiction. It was about 4 pages, and he had this vision of what if we had these underwater floats that we could just put out into the ocean, and they can go and sample throughout the ocean, collecting data. They can come back up to the surface, connect through satellites, and send all of that information back to a control center. So this was a photo or an image within that story. So you can see, right, there's this control center and there's the big satellite dishes there. So this is one of those examples where science fiction has become reality. So there are many different companies and manufacturers for different types of gliders. And they help reduce some of those challenges that I was talking about earlier. So while you'll still go out on the boat to put this glider out into the water and go back out to pick it up and bring it back home, we don't actually need to be out on the boat the entire time to collect data. The gliders can also collect data for long periods of time. So they're out sampling. I'll talk a little bit more about how they sample, but they can cover long distances as well. Some glider missions can be out for several months at a time. This is also one platform, and we can put multiple sensors onto the glider. So this provides us the opportunity to collect co-located data at high resolutions. And maybe I'll point out here, this is a photo of the glider in the water. Up at the top, there's the tail sticking out, and that's where our antennas are. So the glider can still connect with satellites through that antenna. Okay, yeah, so gliders, they can dive down to depth and come back up to the surface. They are buoyancy driven, so there is an air bladder on the inside that inflates and deflates, and that changes how heavy the glider is. So when it's full of water and heavy, it'll sink. When it's more full of air, it's lighter and it'll float. As you can see, if maybe after the talk, you're welcome to come up and look at the glider. There's no propeller on here, right? So it's buoyancy driven. It's moving through the water very slowly. So while it might look like a missile or torpedo, which is often what I get, right, it's very slow. So yeah, so the glider, it also comes up to the surface, as I mentioned, and can connect with Iridium satellites. And at that point, it can send us some of that data back to us on land. But it also gives us an opportunity to send commands to the glider. So we can set specified waypoints, and the glider will fly towards those waypoints. If during the mission we want to change those waypoints, we could do that. While the glider's in the water, we don't have to be out on the boat to do that. And so we can update the glider's trajectory. As I mentioned earlier, we can equip these gliders with multiple sensors. With this particular glider, we have a CTD, so that will collect temperature as well as salinity data. So salinity, you can think about how salty the water is. And then there's also a hydrophone, so it's listening for sounds in the water. And so this glider is owned by WCS Canada. Right, so there, as Bill mentioned, this is a partnered project. So to talk a little bit about some of our field work in 2024, we went out to Safety Channel. So this is within the Inuvialuit Settlement Region. There's a bigger map over on the left. Then there's a little magenta square in there. And so if I zoom that up, that's what we have on the right here. We have Ulahuktuk in the upper left corner, and then Safety Channel is over here. So we had 2 glider missions within Safety Channel. We had one mission that was about 6 hours, and then another mission that was about 18 hours. So we collected 24 hours of data. And so the goal here is to study the ocean conditions, as well as the underwater noise, and how that influences marine mammals. So I'm going to show some of the data that we collected, but I'm going to focus on this second longer mission around Inuvialuit. So there's a river that comes into the channel at that point. Yes, so this is your opportunity to ooh and ah at the glider data that we have. So to orient ourselves to these plots, we have time on the x-axis, we have depth on the y-axis, and then in the colors, we have temperature up at the top and salinity at the bottom. So to highlight a few things, generally near the surface, we have warmer and fresher water. And then at depth, we have colder and saltier water. And yeah, so every single point that we have on these plots are data points. And so we can see all of these profiles that we've collected right over between relatively short periods of time. And then we can see these small scale features. So while it's generally warmer and fresher at the surface, we can see periods of time where we have some colder and saltier regions as well. So using the mouse pointer to highlight some of those. Yeah, so we can also look at this data in a map view. So here I'm looking at an average in the upper 10 meters of the water. And yeah, so map view, again, the colors show temperature and salinity. What we can see here is around Inuvialuit, so on the northern side of the channel, we tend to have warmer and fresher water, whereas on the southern side, we tend to have colder and saltier water. All right, so there's this spatial variation in the ocean properties. In 2025, we went back with the intentions of doing another glider survey. Unfortunately, the glider didn't work. So we used a CTD and collected a lot of CTD data. So we said, okay, our goal here is now to, again, study those ocean conditions, but let's focus at in the regions where water can be entering into the channel. So going into some of the shallower regions around Inuvialuit where that river water is coming in. So this is really shallow. The glider wouldn't be able to fly in that area anyways. And then as well, so on the southern side where the red and yellow dots are other sources of water into the channel. And there's land on either side. So again, this might be a more dangerous location to be sending the glider. If it's really windy, we don't want the glider blowing into the land. And then also to do, again, some transects across the channel so that we can compare that to the glider data. Yeah, so this map and these figures here were created by Ayla McDonald, who was working for me last summer. So very much like those earlier plots of the temperature and salinity, we have time on the x-axis, we have depth on the y-axis, and then the colors are for temperature and for salinity. And then the black dashed lines are where we actually collected the profiles. And so in between those black dashed lines, we've just interpolated the colors. right? So only where there's the dashed lines do we actually have data. So we can see similar trends right near the surface. It's again warmer and fresher compared to depth, but we don't see the same small scale variability like we did from the glider. So going back to some of the glider data that we collected in 2024. So this is now showing data from the hydrophone. So when we're looking at this plot, we again have time on the x-axis, and then on the y-axis is the number of calls, right, or number of detections. And so what we found, we detected some boats. So those are illustrated by the gray shaded areas. Probably a lot of those were us being out on the water. So yeah. And then in blue were fish, in red were ring seals, and then perhaps a bit unexpected, we also detected a couple instances of beluga presence as well. So again, we can look at these in a map view. So where did we pick up these detections? So on the left-hand side shows the detections for the ring seal, and on the right for the beluga whales. And yeah, so the color, the more purple the color, the higher number of calls within a 15-minute period. The boat presence as well as plotted, so that's where you see the black outline around the colored points. And then an important thing to consider when you're looking at this acoustic data is the detection radius. So at the hydrophone, it's at one location, but it can be picking up sounds that are made from further away that have propagated to the hydrophone. So for ring seals, there's a detection radius of about 2 kilometers. So if you're in the middle of that purple dot, your 2-kilometer radius is around that point. And we can see, right, the size of that dot is largely the size of that glider area. And then for the beluga whales, there's a larger detection radius of about 5 kilometers, right, which is greater than the width of safety channel here. So those detections might actually be coming from belugas that were maybe just outside of the channel. Yeah, so in conclusion, we've collected some glider data up in the Arctic, and so the gliders are showing some promise for collecting meaningful oceanographic and acoustic data. And for next steps, we're hoping to go back and collect more data, and this time hopefully for a longer period of time as well. Yeah, so where's some acknowledgements? Yeah, this is done with WCS Canada. They received some funding from CERNAC to purchase the glider. I also got some funding from Polar. And then we've received a lot of support from the Hunters and Trappers Committee there as well, helping us hire wildlife monitors and boat operators. So that is what I have for you.
Wow, that was awesome. I have a question. So I'm going to start. Do you mind throwing up your second last slide there? The one before your conclusion? Yeah.
Yeah.
Can you tell me, now I know I was messing around with technology while you were speaking, but can you tell me a little bit more about what this tells us? Do we get a sense from the data that you've collected, the relative impact of noise on the belugas versus the ring seals?
Uh, not not really. I would say yes. So it's just a very short snapshot of time that I wouldn't really feel comfortable, yeah, making any sort of, yeah, judgments around boat noise and where the marine mammals are. Um,
Were
yeah.
you witnessing yourself, though, getting a sense of behavioral changes?
Mm, I can't say that I was. I don't know. Maybe that's a question for Bill when you go out in the boats. Sometimes they're curious. So
Yeah.
if we're out on the boat, sometimes you'll see a seal head pop up. Um, but yeah, I don't know if you have anything else to add to that.
Um, yeah, like I think Tara's effectively correct there. Like these small community boats are generally not what we're concerned about when we're talking about underwater noise. They are much, much quieter than a large ship. These small boats we can pick up from probably about 3 or 4 kilometers away. The large ships we can pick up from, in some cases, 100 kilometers away. And so it's an order of magnitude closer. Um, yeah, the seals are also hunted from these boats as well, and so they're much more attuned to boat behavior than to just the noise as well. Like they know, they hear these boats, they could be getting hunted right now, but the hunters tend to start and stop and they'll scan, and so they have very different behavior than say just us when we're transiting across the area. We'll often see, like Tara said, a seal head pop up. The seal will look, and if we get too close, then we'll get a big splash of their tail as they dive back down again. And so, but in this year of the glider, um, there was a group of about 40 ring seals in kind of a herd, moving through the center of Safety Channel, and that's probably who we're getting most of these detections from. And when we just stopped and watched them, we sat there for about half an hour, and they were not concerned with us at all. We weren't doing anything to them, and they seemed to know that. So, yeah, it's varying impacts for sure.
I'm just trying to get onto the chat right now that's online, but while I'm waiting to do that, Richard, you have a question. Please, as loud as you can, and then I'll repeat it for everyone else.
With our number all the time. Question for Bill. Right at the beginning, you had ship frequency as it was coming up to the hydrophone and back out again. What frequencies do the whales sing or whatever?
Recording in progress.
And the other question is there any background noise during the winter of sea ice noise when that cracks and whatever, and in proportion to the ship? Is it up there or down there?
I can repeat the question if you want, Kate.
Please.
Okay, so for those online, two-part question. The first part was how do the frequencies at which the whales sing or make their calls, how does that compare to the ship noise? And then the second question is, what's it like in the winter? Are there other sources of sound in the wintertime? Okay, so first question around those frequencies. So most of our ship noise is between, we'll get more technical here, so I apologize. I'm not going to explain what the hertz scale is, but that's what we're talking about. All the way from 10 hertz up to 50 kilohertz. That's the typical range of ship noise when it's really close to the hydrophone or to a whale. Most of that noise is between 10 hertz and about 1,000 hertz or 1 kilohertz. So that's kind of the core range. For comparison, human hearing, we hear between about 20 hertz and 20 kilohertz or 20,000 hertz. Whales, big whales, like bowhead whales, they're hearing between about 10 hertz and 20 kilohertz, decently similar to humans. Beluga whales are hearing between about 100 hertz and 100,000 hertz or 100 kilohertz because they're echolocators, so they have to be able to hear at those very high frequencies. So both of those species, bowheads and belugas, both overlap quite a bit with ship noise in terms of their hearing, bowheads in particular. Bowhead sounds are between about 50 hertz and 500 hertz. Their songs go a bit higher, but their main calls are right in that range. So pretty much a perfect overlap with that core ship noise. Beluga calls, on the other hand, most of them are much higher. Their whistles are typically in the 1 to 10 kilohertz range. Their echolocation clicks are about 50 kilohertz. So they have much less overlap in their calls with ship noise. But there is still some overlap when ships are really close and at the lower frequency ranges as well. And the seals are mostly in the lower frequencies like the bowhead whales as well, with both their hearing and the sounds that they make. So a fairly similar impact that we would see with the bowhead whales. Over winter, yes, ice. Ice makes a lot of sounds. So anyone who's gone out walking on the ice anytime in the winter, especially during temperature changes, you'll hear the ice making all sorts of interesting sounds. So that happens on sea ice as well, but the ice is often much thicker. I've measured about 2 meters of ice while I've been up in the summer, or not in the summer, in the spring. And so that's quite a bit thicker than our lake ice around here, for example. In multi-year ice, that could be 4 meters thick, 5 meters thick, because ice has kind of gone on top of each other. Regardless, that thick ice makes a lot of sounds, but when it's cracking and breaking up, it's even more noisy, pieces of ice crashing into each other. But it's still an order of magnitude lower than the ship noise. So there is a natural loud source of noise. It's not nearly as loud as ship noise, though. Yeah.
Just wanted to clear that off. You up front.
Yeah, hi, my name is Nicholas. So to add on Richard's question, because of that overlap between frequencies from boats and whales, have we witnessed a change of behavior? What frequency whales would be using to communicate when this overlap is quite frequent?
Yeah.
So I think the question was, are whales starting to use behavioral changes, starting to use different frequencies because of the overlap of the frequency between boats and whales? Is that right?
Yep.
Thanks for your question, Nicholas. Go ahead.
Yeah, so we've been looking for it with the species we work on. We haven't seen it yet, but it has been shown in other species further south, and especially in like terrestrial studies, like with frogs, for example, they'll see frogs starting to call at higher frequencies to get away from the sound of the highway that's right next to their pond. Another common thing that we see is repetition. So instead of changing your frequencies, the animal will just say the same thing over and over and over again, so that there's a better chance of it being heard. The final thing is that they'll speak louder. And so that we have seen with Arctic species, where they'll make louder calls when it's noisier out to try to be heard over top of that loud sound, effectively. So that we've seen with bowhead whales in response to pile driving and seismic air guns. And then we've recently showed it with bearded seals in response to sounds made by ice. Actually, they increase their sounds when it's noisy from the ice.
The back there, yes, please.
Yeah, my question, maybe it's not part of the study. Are you able to pick up the signal about submarine?
Can you pick up the signal of
Submarine.
Submarines.
submarines?
Sorry, I smile because that is like the most common question I've had since I've worked on this project. Do we hear the Russians in particular? The answer is I do not think I've picked up a submarine. And so submarine sounds should look the same mostly as the larger ship sounds. Most of them are, sorry, I say most of them because I grew up watching The Hunt for Red October with their quiet submarine, which is science fiction. We think maybe it's a hidden secret. We think that they're all running off of propellers. It is very close kept secrets though, those submarines. In fact, there's some hydrophones in Canada where the Navy gets the data first and scrubs it whenever their ships are nearby before they give it out to the public. So there are some secrets there. I wouldn't know if it was a submarine is the short answer. We have ship track data for all the ships that are broadcasting their signals, and there are still probably about a third of the detections from, say, the 2023 year I was showing the ship noise map of, where there's a ship noise signal and we have no detection. We don't know what it was. I mean, we have no signal from the tracking data, so we don't know what it was. That could be a submarine, but it could also be a sailboat with its engine running or something like that too. So there's some unknowns in there, and I don't think I would know it was a submarine, though, is the short answer. And if they're doing their job right, I shouldn't hear them. So,
Go ahead, Richard.
Good question. You've mapped the different routes across the Arctic. What's going along the North Russian coast? I presume that's a more common route because of the ice melt along the window. Is there any studies going on along there that can say what's happening to that neck of the woods?
The question was about the Russian coastline and the change in traffic that Speaker Bill Halliday might have observed.
okay. So we did a literature review a few years ago, just looking at what noise studies there were in the Arctic. And there were a bunch for North America and, say, around Norway. And there was nothing for Russia. And part of that is a lot of Russians publish in Russian-only journals, which means that they don't make it into our English search engines. But then there's also just a lot of things that are internal within Russia that we're not seeing. So Russia's definitely a big black box for these sorts of studies, especially work being done by Russian scientists, especially right now in the political climate. But I do understand that there are a lot of monitoring networks in that area, and we don't get to see the data, unfortunately. Russia, the Northern Sea Route definitely is seeing more traffic than the Northwest Passage. I wouldn't say there's less ice, but there's more infrastructure. So Russia has put a lot more development into the Northern Sea Route than Canada has into the Northwest Passage. There are deep water ports. They have nuclear powered icebreakers that are out year round. So the Northwest Pass or the Northern Sea Route is getting year round traffic right now. The Northwest Passage is not getting year round traffic. We see 4 months of shipping a year. They see 12 months of shipping a year on that side. It's greatly reduced in the wintertime. It's still only a couple of ships per month that go in January or February, say. But yeah, they're seeing quite a bit more on that side. It's not necessarily through traffic, though. A lot of it's destinational. So they've got an LNG facility, for example, that is a big part of it. And that's in, I can remember where it is, but I can't remember the name of it right now. But much further away from the Bering Strait, closer to the Norway side. And that's driving a lot of the through winter traffic. They're keeping those LNG tankers going year round, for example. But, yeah.
Any other questions? Please, Graham.
Have you noticed any correlation also on the fishes as same as marine mammals related to the traffic distance?
The question for folks online was if the researchers had noticed any correlation between ship noise and traffic and fish species. So far, the conversation's been about whales and seals.
Yeah, so we can pick up some fish, likely Arctic cod and sculpins, making sounds on our recorders. Tara showed a figure that the data that we got off the glider with that in particular. They're very quiet. We can only pick them up from, say, 10 meters away. So it's really hard with such a quiet little species to do a good job with passive acoustics in that way. However, there have been a couple of telemetry studies with fish, with Arctic cod and with a sculpin species, actually, near the community of Resolute a few years ago. And they found that those tagged fish did change their movement patterns when a ship came into the community effectively. They swam in different ways. They didn't group together the same way that they did before. So there is some preliminary evidence that the fish are also being impacted, Arctic fish in particular being impacted. And I am collaborating with some DFO scientists on a new study in Cambridge Bay, so just a little bit further east of our monitoring network. And we're effectively trying to do the same thing with a few other species now as well. So hopefully some more data soon, because fish are just as important as marine mammals, and we don't want to ignore them.
Any other questions from the audience? One more from Nicholas. Go ahead.
One more, yeah.
Yeah, it's fine.
So coming back to your noise propagation model, we saw a map view of it in 2D, and my question is, what does the noise propagation look like in the water column? Because as we saw, the temperature and the salinity changes. So because of that anisotropy, does it change anything that is relevant to your study? And where Beluga and Bowell, where do they live? Which depth do they usually stay in? And taking that into account, would it be relevant?
Question for folks online. Is the where you are in the water column where the fish or the beluga are in the water column having an effect on their behavior, looking at noise propagation closer to the surface versus deeper down. Do you think you could throw that slide out for folks on this?
It'll take a little bit to get back there, but yeah. Oh, it didn't take nearly as long as I thought. Yeah, so there's the map showing two-dimensional sound propagation. You're right. But it is a 3D model that went into this. And so sound travels underwater like a wave. It's going down, hitting something down below, whether it's a change in water properties or the bottom, and then it's reflecting or refracting back up. And so all oceans in the world have different sound channels effectively. So the thermocline, if folks know what that is, and Tara wasn't able to show it because we were in too shallow of an area, effectively. But areas where the temperature and salinity effectively can make it much more efficient for sound to travel. So in the Arctic, that's around 50 meters deep is where the sound channel lives. In other oceans in the world, it's a deep sound channel. It's down around 1,000 meters. So in the Arctic, sound travels much more efficiently in relatively shallow waters. There's some evidence that when the whales, like belugas, aren't trying to feed on bottom fish, but instead they're feeding in fish that are in the water column, they do tend to hang around the thermocline, which is where sound is traveling more efficiently. And that might be also for themselves because they're such an acoustic species, it's more efficient for them to forage in that area. And it may also just be where the fish are. But if that's where they're hanging out and that's where sound is traveling more efficiently, that also means that's where most of the ship noise is going to be right in that sound channel. Bowhead whales typically don't dive much more than 50 to 100 meters either. They're also focusing in on a layer of zooplankton that typically concentrate in that area as well. So yes, three-dimensional sound propagation is very important, and there are certain water layers that will have more noise than others, and that does seem to overlap with a lot of the time where the animals are. They don't actually spend that much time at the surface. They're underwater most of the time.
Sally, you have a question?
Yes, I now that you're back in this slide deck, there was one of the photos of this platform with bubbles all around it. Now,
Yes.
what is that?
Let's see if I can grab that one. That's back a little ways here. That was a bubble curtain, though. Oh, wait a minute. This one, or I think I was back. Oh, yes. It was when I was talking about management stuff.
Yes.
That's so this is I believe they're doing some pile driving here. And so they've got a very large pole that they're banging down, like with a hammer, a very large hammer, into the water. They're probably doing an offshore wind turbine or something like that here. That, what you see is a bubble curtain. And so it's a common mitigation tool for pile driving in particular. Effectively, they've got a hose on the bottom that's blowing air through it with little holes all around it, and it's letting bubbles out constantly. And the idea is that that really noisy signal coming out from those hammer strikes is going to hit the bubbles, hit air, hit a new medium, and it's going to lose a bunch of its energy before it bursts through to the other side. And so this one has two bubble rings around it, one close and another one far. Some will even go as many as three. And it's a decently effective mitigation tool for impulsive sounds like hammer strikes. Not very practical for a moving ship, though.
Wonderful. There's a question online about electric marine motors on ships and the experience of the researchers on that source of noise.
Yep. So electric engines are becoming more common. They are just like the EVs, the electric cars on the street here. They're supposed to be much more fuel efficient. The sources of noise that we see from ships are, again, the propeller cavitation, the engine noise, and a few other things on board. So the electric ships don't have a big diesel engine on board. That means that that's one less source of noise from the ships. However, they still have a propeller, which is the biggest source of low frequency noise that propagates really far. So when you get close to the ship, you pick up a lot of the engine noise, and so that's not going to be there, or at least not there in the same way on an electric ship. I haven't personally measured one, but I've seen a few studies that have looked at it. So we still get the cavitation, but we lose the engine noise effectively.
And some of that pollution from the fuel.
Yes, yeah, this is regardless. I'm just talking about the noise, but yes.
Yeah. Okay. Well, any other questions? Okay. One at the back. One more question. Sure. How do you manage cellular access and
Communication? That seems like a great question for Ted.
yeah. If you don't mind repeating just the question a little bit.
Yeah. So how do we handle the loss of cellular reception and how do we communicate? So we don't have cell reception at our field camp. The glider communicates. So it has two modes of communication. One is its own Wi-Fi. So we have our field laptop. We can communicate with the glider directly. It also connects through the Iridium satellite. So when we're back at our field camp, we don't have cell reception. So we got a Starlink so we could have internet and then we can, essentially get that data from the gliders. It goes to the satellites, it goes to a cloud. We can then see what the glider sent us. It also allows us to talk back to the glider. So we do that through the internet, sends it up, then to the satellite, then to the glider. Yeah.
I did ask Tara, you are allowed to come up and touch the robot. The little sensor on the top that she was talking about earlier, maybe keep your fingers off that one. It's
On the nose.
yeah. Sensor. So maybe just don't poke that thing, but you're welcome to come have a closer look, of course. Thank you again, everyone, for joining us tonight. Something I forgot to mention earlier. If you don't have your $15 cash and you're no longer carrying a checkbook like most of us, you can become a member by just going on to the Yukon Science Institute website, and you just scroll down to the bottom and you can click and become a member through e-transfer and payment that way. I think Visa as well. So I'd love to have you join our newsletter group and be in touch about future science happenings. One last question from the back, yeah? Well, so far, we're going to be joining for the Biodiversity Forum. We're going to be having an evening lecture to coincide with I believe it's going to be Friday evening, and it will be the Laurie Schroeder Memorial Lecture. I will post more about that online, but we are having a Dr. Isla Myers, is that right? Isla, sorry. Isla Myers. Sorry, go ahead, Sid. March 27th. Yeah, we're gonna try and do something for February, but I'll keep you posted. Okay, you're welcome. Wonderful to see you again. Have a great night. Thank you so much, you too. Our Vice President, Sally, right? Thank you for your and I'll be Tara, is this your stick, hey? Or is that
No, that's Bill's. Yeah.
Yeah.
Hey, Greg.
Parts. I'm wondering.